I now have pleasure in introducing our first speaker today, which is me. My first two slides will tell you more about me, so I'm just going to dive straight in. The theme is unifying missions data. And you should be able to see my screen. We want to become a community that works together, developing better understanding to improve our task in the future. So, which is easier, to unify the body of Christ or to unify missions data? Some Bible teachers say that all true Christians are already united. In that case, it's certainly more difficult, I can tell you, to unify missions data because it all starts off disunited. Unifying data is always more difficult than you expect, even after you've learned to expect how difficult it is. You see, you as a human being are endowed by your Creator with superb communication gifts. You process information as an expert from birth, and you learn more skills as you go along. Computers, on the other hand, do not have the breath of God. Unfortunately, some experts in artificial intelligence don't understand the fundamental difference. They seem to think they would like to create software so advanced that they can worship it and even surrender our God-given place in the universe to the work of our hands. But for us in missions, we use computers. We don't worship them. Now, in this short introduction to unifying missions data, I'm going to make several assertions about data without having the time to explain myself in full. So instead, I'm planning briefly to boast, like the Apostle Paul, of the experience that God has given me. In that way, you may know who's speaking to you. So since 1995, I've been wrestling with global data, managing data, designing data, troubleshooting data problems around the world. I maintained my position in corporate life through two different global mergers. Each time the company grew, so that finally I was working for an organization called Johnson Diversey, was a corporation turning over a few billion US dollars a year. Then in 2007, God sent me into global church information work, which is where I am to this day. The chief executive asked me more gently than Pharaoh in the Bible to stay, but in the end, God gave me the money and let me go. God is good. The corporation, although small compared with many, was genuinely global. This gives you an idea of the scope. EMA stands for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. NA is North America. And we had unusual strength in Japan for a multinational corporation. It was in this context that I learned about what makes good quality information. Here are some characteristics of good quality information. Data quality is complex. It's not simple. The good news is that not all of these characteristics need to be perfect in every situation. But some of the bad news is that the most important characteristics may depend on what we want to use the data for. So if you change and want to use it for something else, you may need to improve the quality in a different area. When I use people group data for global strategy, those 4 C's at the top are vital to me. The data has to be comparable, compatible, consistent, and complete. But if I want data to pray for a specific people group, then those are almost irrelevant. The big question then, when I come to pray, is it accessible? Can I find it now? Other bad news is that if any one of these aspects is bad enough, it doesn't matter if the others are perfect. The information may be completely useless. When, for strategy, I want the data to be comparable, compatible, consistent, and complete, it's perfectly okay if it's not very accessible. If I spend a day or so to get hold of it, I can live with that. But if accessibility gets bad enough, if, say, after internet searches and emails and phone calls, I just cannot get access, then I'm going to give up. And the data, however good it is in other aspects, is completely useless to me. And things get even more difficult when we try to bring two sets of data together. That's what we're talking about today, unifying data. In 1980, back in 1980, when I started training as a computer programmer, I was told about GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And the implication is that if you put quality data in, you will get quality data out. That sounds great. But I'm afraid that after 20 years of experience, and it took that long, after 20 years of experience, wondering why everything was so difficult, I discovered another truth. One that is totally counterintuitive. If you bring together quality and quality of different types, they've been done in different places, quality type 1, quality type 2. Let's say they're really good quality data. Well, you can say that accessibility probably goes up because they're now together. Great. And we could say that accuracy is probably average overall. That's okay. But I can tell you from theory and from experience that every other aspect of data quality goes down when you bring those two together. So quality in may be meant to equal quality out, but if you add two different lots of quality together, you get garbage. You find you're comparing apples and oranges in the other proverbial term. The reason is that so much of data quality is dependent on context. A couple of years after the last merger that I went through, I was talking with the financial controller of the corporation. And he said, Chris, I get the feeling that our data quality has gone backwards since the merger. I said to him, Clive, as soon as the ink was dry, the data quality plummeted because we had two sets of data that we had to try to integrate. Now, there is one thing that can help us. And that is if both sets of quality use the same data standards. Then when we bring them together, things are a whole lot easier. I said that quality is dependent on context. Well, the fact is that data standards can provide a shared data context. So if quality 1 has been using the same data standards as quality 2, we have a chance to get quality out. And that is why we do the work in Harvest Information Standards. Harvest Information Standards is a cooperative venture of organizations that share a desire to facilitate the task taking the gospel to Jesus Christ to all the people of the world. So we assist mission sending groups by improving data sharing. How do we do that? Through standardized codes and categories for common data sets. But I just want to add one more caveat, one more general principle before I hand over to my HIS colleagues to get more specific about our data standards and how they can help us. This is what I call the data standards iceberg. The most obvious part of the standard is the codes. And codes are often what people ask for. We need a standard code and everything will be all right. Well, codes are really important. They are what get really embedded into the data. So they are the key. And they're the key metaphorically, and in data terms, we use the term key often to mean something like the code. So they are important, but underneath the codes are the names. Let's say we have a code ENG. Some of us might be able to guess what the code is for. But we need to do more than guess, and it's the name that tells you that it's English, if that's what it is. So that's good. So now we can be sure that Eng means English, but that's usually not enough. There is a hidden layer beneath that. Do we mean all sorts of English around the world? Or do we mean only the one English that's spoken by the English people in England? I was just sharing before we began that I'm having to get used to calling it the King's English now, having spent all my life calling it the Queen's English. But what is the English that we're talking about? That's why we often have to go down beneath the names and understand the definitions, the real meaning of what we're talking about. And that is the end of that talk. How are we doing for time? Okay, we need to carry on. There will be a chance for questions and answers at the end of the next few sessions, and I'll still be around for that. But I want now to introduce our next speakers, Janell Nordmoe and Joan Spanney, both long-standing members of SIL. SIL is the organization that kicked off the global Bible translation movement, and it still does so much to support it, not least in the area of data. I find everyone at SIL seems to wear more than one hat, but most relevant to us is that Janell is the ISO 639-3 registrar. I think she might be explaining a bit about what that means in her talk. Joan seems to have done almost everything in her career. And sometimes I think she still is doing almost everything. But her current main role is in research for SIL. Both of them work with me additionally as editors in Harvest Information Standards. So over to you guys.
All right, thank you, Chris. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So during this presentation, you'll be hearing both from myself and from Joan. And let's see here. and this is a brief outline of what we'll be talking about. So the first topic is where did these language codes come from? How did the Registry of Languages come to exist that's now part of Harvest Information Standards? Second. In 1951, SIL, which had been working with minority languages since 1934, produced a booklet describing 46 minority languages. This language data, called Ethnologue, was issued on a regular basis. It grew rapidly. Maps were added. In 1958, it was published in book form. By the time the information was put into a database in 1971, the Ethnologue contained information on nearly 4,500 languages. As knowledge of world languages increased, the set grew to become the most comprehensive list of world languages. By the 1990s, there were more than 6,800 codes. And in 1997, the Ethnologue was published online. Meanwhile, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, adopted ISO 639, a standard for identifiers for the language names based on existing national standards from multiple sources. When Part 2 of 639 was published in 1998, it had fewer than 400 identifiers and was insufficient for many purposes. In 2002, ISO invited SIL International to prepare a new part of the standard for language identifiers based on the Ethnologue codes, but reconciling them with those already in use. This standard was approved by national standards organizations and adopted in 2007 as ISO 639 Part 3, providing three-letter identifiers for over 7,500 living, extinct, ancient, and constructed languages. SIL is the appointed registration authority for the standard and administers the annual cycle for changes and updates as a function separate from the Ethnologue, under the supervision of ISO, and following the procedures established by the standard itself. It is the editorial policy of Ethnologue to follow ISO 639-3 in determining what linguistic varieties should be listed as languages. Why language codes? So I'm getting the following observations from a paper called Linguistics as a Community Activity, The Paradox of Freedom Through Standards by SIL's Gary Simons. With the advent of information sharing over the internet, the challenge is for the international community to align its practices to avoid confusion and increase accessibility. A standard like ISO 639-3 for language identification is needed so that the puzzlers interested in a particular language can locate all the relevant pieces. For example, the international community needs to clearly communicate the language a document is written in, that is spoken or signed in a recording, or documented in a dictionary or grammar, what we need to identify terms in terminological databases, the source language of a translated document, what languages are supported by a software tool, covered by translation services, and the language proficiencies of people and organizations. Historically, languages were identified by name. However, different languages may have the same name. The same language may have different names in different areas or in other languages. Outsiders may invent a different name for a speaker community. This happens a lot. 250 languages have the same primary name as another language. There's a large amount of data related to languages, and with the internet, the amount of digital information available is growing fast. How do we talk about languages so that each puzzle worker can contribute to the whole. Too many names lead to confusion and frustration. The solution is to use a unique identifier for each language. The ethnologue used 3-letter codes for languages, similar to those used in the airline industry to identify airports. Think of the iceberg that Chris described. Codes and names can be seen from above. What is the basic meaning underneath? We can think of ISO 6393 codes like time zones that cover the Earth. Each code is like a zone that covers all varieties of a language, with the goal that all the zones cover the whole Earth, all the speakers of all the languages. The major criteria have to do with both intelligibility, distance between varieties, that is, how well can two people using related languages understand one another, and development, including a standardized way of writing, use in media, education, law, etc. What is the Registry of Languages? The Registry of Languages obtains its codes and reference names from ISO 6393. Language in country information comes from the ethnologue. How is the standard updated? Languages change, and knowledge about the world's languages is constantly being refined as pieces are added to the puzzle. The registrar for 6393 collects the change requests and vets them for adequate evidence. Then an expert panel evaluates the proposals and adopts or rejects them. The results of the decisions are posted early in the calendar year at the ISO 6393 Registration Authority's website at sil.org. The types of changes are create, retire, and update. In cases where an identifier needs to be split, the original identifier is retired, still retaining its meaning, and is superseded by new ones. The new ones are preferred for accuracy, but the former ones do not lose their meaning. If you use the standard, please keep in mind that the code set is updated at least annually, and it is important to refresh your data. How is the Registry of Languages updated? The Registry of Languages makes use of the ethnologue code tables. The ISO 6393 code, the 3-letter identifier, plus the language reference name, is augmented with ethnologue information, such as alternate names, but most importantly, by information about in which countries languages are used, called language in country. This is useful in cases where languages are represented in more than one geopolitical area of the world. The Registry of Languages is limited to living languages. To talk about how the Registry of Languages could be improved, I'll be turning to Joan Spanny. Over to you, Joan.
Thanks, Janell. That is a great overview of the Registry of Languages. So Janell talked about how the registry is updated, and I'm going to go through some possibilities about how it might be improved, that is, changed in its structure to make it more useful to you all and others who use it, we hope. Next slide, Janell. So Janell and I, along with advising from Chris, have been considering 4 changes. The first, I'm just going to go through them quickly and then I'll go through them individually. The first relates to incorporating a new subset of languages, not new languages, but a new code set, if you will, to cover the deaf sign languages of the world that are not yet included in the ISO 639-3 standard. The second change has to do with simplifying the body of data that the ROL shares in retaining the language and country relationships as part of the HIS standard, but removing references to dialect and dialect alternate names because these are available and useful elsewhere. They are included in the published ethnologue tables, so they sort of got grandfathered in with the ROL. A third change is to add back into the ROL a changes table. It was originally there and got taken out, and we'd like to put it back. And the fourth is to change the publication schedule to coincide with the schedule of updating of ISO 639.3 rather than remain tied to the ethnologue. Next slide. So looking at the subset of sign languages that are not represented yet in the ISO 639.3 standard. For several years, there's been a cooperative group of deaf ministries working together, and they developed about 6 or 7 years ago a code set to identify sign languages across the world. So they developed and used this together, and they manage it jointly. Two key organizations involved are DOOR and the Global Sign Languages team of SIL, but there are others involved giving input. So these groups focus on scripture translation and scripture engagement among the world's deaf communities, and they needed a fuller representation of the languages that they know to exist or that they think exist. Their identifiers are shaped differently than the ISO identifiers. They use a two-letter, two-digit identifier form, and I've given the example of Kiribati Sign Language there, KI66. The numbers are random, anywhere between 01 and 99. Currently, there are 228 languages that are not included in ISO 639.3 that are included in this set. And the ministries maintain a mapping with an additional 159 that are in ISO. This expanded set of sign languages has been shared with Progress Bible since 2018 and has been in use in their language service since then. The data is structured similarly to that in the ethnologue in that it includes a primary name, the identifier, a primary name, alternate names, and relationships to the geography, so countries of the world. Next slide. Oh, sorry, there was one more thing that I wanted to talk about on that slide. You might be wondering why they're not in the ISO standard. And so rather than wait for you to ask that question, I'll answer it now. In many cases, the languages have plenty of evidence that they exist, but no one has taken the initiative to document them and present a change request to the ISO body that Janell described. So it awaits the initiative of a group to make that request. In some other cases, the evidence is still out as to whether this is a truly distinct sign language that's developing as its own linguistic entity, or is it a variety of perhaps a sign language brought through education. For example, American Sign Language is used in many countries around the world. And in some places, it's staying quite close to American Sign Language with some very modest variation. In other places, it's truly diverging from American Sign Language and becoming its own, typically national sign language developed for use within that country. So it's a long process to assist language communities and ministry organizations wanting to or already working with these communities to make a request. And as you can see, 228 is way too many to be ignorant of and to ignore in the space of ministries among the deaf around the world. Now, next slide. Thanks, Janell. So the second change that we're proposing is that we retain in the Registry of Languages the language and country relationship information. The standard doesn't tell you where a language is used. It gives you a name and a code and alternate names. It's the ethnologue that helps situate that information geographically. The ethnologue also includes a fairly long list in some cases of dialect and alternate dialect names. The primary purpose for that is to help people to search. Perhaps they know the name of a dialect. Well, what language is this dialect part of? Perhaps they know an alternate name of a language. What language is it representing? So it's the whole list of names given is really to help for searching, not particularly because the ethnologue is saying, here's a comprehensive list of all the dialects and their names. You'll be hearing from Allan Starling in a little bit about the Registry of Language Varieties. And because that list is curated very intentionally for the breadth of language varieties, Janell and I really think that we should encourage its use and simplify and hopefully remove some confusion from the Registry of Languages by taking out the dialect and the alternate dialect names. I just want to give an illustration. Next slide, Janell. An illustration of how this confusion could occur. This is an example of the Hung language in Laos. It's also spoken in Vietnam. So on the left side, you see the list of the language name way down at the bottom, the dialects and alternate dialect names associated with the language in Laos. And on the right side, an even longer set of names and dialect names in the space of Vietnam. Just keep clicking, Janell, slowly. So the language name right down at the bottom, there we go, highlighted now. The Hung language is indicated by the type L. Then we have in Vietnam instances of language alternate names way down at the bottom of the right-hand side of the list. And keep clicking, Janell. There we go. Now we've got dialect names in Laos and then alternate dialect names. And there's really no way to associate the alternate dialect names with their dialects. This is something that the Registry of Language Varieties does more ably than the list, the language index tab file from Ethnologue. So that's why we propose to take out all the Ds and the DAs and just condense this set to the Ls and the LAs with their language and country relationships. Next slide. So when the Registry of Languages was first developed, we as the registration authority for that, or the steward for the ROL, we promised a change table. And when ISO 639.3 was adopted, we stopped publishing a change table, mostly because the ethnologue doesn't publish a change table, and because the ISO standard does publish annual changes. However, there are changes that either exist today in the Registry of Languages, differences that exist today, or differences that we're proposing to add that would make it valuable to have a changes table specifically for the Registry of Languages. Some of the things that the ISO changes table doesn't include are primary name changes where they are implemented in ethnologue, but not in ISO 639.3. One of the things that, I'll digress a moment, the names in the ROL are actually coming from the ethnologue primary country, primary name. it can be different from the ISO reference name. And that's something else that needs to be clarified.
John, this is Chris.
Yeah.
You need to keep going and not have too many digressions now.
I will do that. So there are changes to the registry, changes to the language and country relationships. There are things that get removed from the ethnologue without explanation. And the explanation is that they become extinct. And so they're no longer in the living languages set of the registry of languages. And then if we do include the additional sign language identifiers, where will changes be described for those, unless it is in a change table here? Next slide. And this is my last slide. Currently, the cycle of publication is annually for the ethnologue, and the Registry of Languages borrows those tables and republishes them on the HIS site. As the ISO 639 registration authority moves to a cycle that is more frequent, it's not determined yet, but it hopefully will be more frequent than annually. It would be valuable to publish those changes on that cycle, especially since one of the criticisms of the standard is that it doesn't change fast enough. Back to you, Janell.
And so just to wrap up, this is how you can connect with the Registry of Languages. You'll see the HIS Registry's website there, and you're looking for the tree image, which shows the languages of the world. In the center is Ethnologue. That's just one screenshot of one language. You can see that it offers mapping information as well as language vitality information. And then finally on the right is the website that you would use to interact with me. If you have questions about a language code, you can contact me through that email address. You can also download tables from that and look up any language and find the change history as well. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Janell and Joan. So we moved from a general talk introduction about the importance of data standards in unifying data. And then we moved to a specific presentation about language data and language data standards, both the external ISO standard, but also ROL, Registry of Languages, which is the missions data standard that we use and we provide through the Harvest Information Standards. So now we're going to move on to a related standard, which is the Registry of Language Varieties. And Allan Starling will take us through that. He is the former international coordinator of Gospel Recordings International, now Gospel Recordings Network, GRN. He's currently Director of Language Research at GRN, and he's the editor of our Registry of Language Varieties, ROLV. Some of you may know it previously as ROD, Registry of Dialects. His family name is Starling, which is the name of a very common bird here in Europe. But he now works in California, but he likes to remind me that in South Africa, where he came from originally, there's a really special variety of starling called the superb starling. So now I give you the superb Allan Starling.
Thank you very much. And it is still early here in California, so I'll give you all a welcome and a good morning wherever you are. I'm going to share my screen right now and only have a limited amount of time. So we'll go ahead. There we go. And I'm going to have to oversimplify things because of the time constraints here, but You can certainly contact me afterwards if you have more questions, and we may have time to answer that. Well, as has just been mentioned, we have the Registry of Dialects, which has now changed its name to the Registry of Language Varieties. And I'm going to oversimplify some things now because of the time. So I apologize to those of you who are experts. Anyway, the Registry of Language Varieties, the steward is Global Recordings Network, and I'm the editor for them. If you want to see all the registries, you can go to this one, hisregistries.org. And if you want to see the Global Recordings Network, you can see all the varieties, all thousands of them are actually on the Global Recordings Network website. So just a question here first. Why do we have standards and codes? It's already been answered. I'm going to just answer it in a little different way. So let's just by view of a illustration, go to a small bachelor party, which has just ended, and they're getting the bill. It says there were 7 people that attended the meeting. So let's check this out. Let me see. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people. That's correct. Somebody says, no, that's not correct. There's less than that. Well, let's check it out. Okay. We'll put them together and we find that, first of all, this one, Bill and William, are the same person. Some people call him Bill, some people call him William. So there was only one person there with that name. And then the same problem with Jimmy and James. It's actually the same person, but he's called by different names by different people. That added to that confusion. Now, what about Daniel and Ezekiel? They actually are twins, but they are individuals, even though they're very similar to each other. They are twins and they are individual people, so we have to count them separately. So we have 4, but then there was one more. Oh, Mary. What is Mary doing at a bachelor party? Well, as we found out, she's really just the caterer, so we don't have to count Mary. So we ended up with 4 people instead of 7. So I'm going to ask for a refund there. Okay, so now just moving to a different way of talking about it. Let's talk about people groups instead of people. We'll talk about languages. Languages. So now it was a small meeting, and somebody did an account, and they said 7 different languages were spoken at this meeting. So let's have a look at that. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different languages. Somebody says, no, that's not correct. Let's have a look at them. Okay. So what we find is this is one language, but some people call it this, some people call it that, and of course they call themselves by a different name. So that added to some confusion. And here's another case where these two are very similar, but they're really the same language, different names. Now, here are 2 that are very much alike, but they are individuals, so we have to count them separately. And then there was one more, wasn't there? Oh, yes, this one. Well, we had a look at it and we found it's not really a name of a language. It happens to be the name of a location where a different language is spoken. So we're not going to count that. So we end up with 4 instead of 7 again. So how can we sort out this problem or help to alleviate it? Well, one of the ways is to give each variety a unique code. So here's our list of varieties. And let's see, we'll just pick out two of them. And I can hear somebody say, wait a minute, you said give each a unique code. And those two codes are the same. Well, they're actually for something else. So let's just broaden this out. And we'll find there's a language called Nordmoe, and it has this code. And we heard about that in the previous presentation. It's been given this. So this is a primary language, and it has the ISO code. And then there are these two varieties are connected with that language, but they are different. So they each need their own code. So we'll give them a code. And then we do a little bit more research, and we find there are a whole list of varieties of this Nordmoe language, and each one is really distinct. So we have to give each of them their own code. And by the way, these are real codes. They're not just something I made up for this illustration. So now we have a question. We have languages and we have language varieties. We used to call them dialects, but some people objected to that term. So now we're calling them language varieties. So what is the difference? Well, you have a primary language, and each primary language may have several different varieties. And some varieties may be very similar to each other, and some may be quite different. So we give each of them their own code so we can identify them as separate individuals. So there's approximately 7,100 languages, and as Janell already told you, each year that number changes a little bit. It's changing. It used to change a lot. It's only changing a little bit now as more research is done. But there are also approximately 7,000 varieties associated with these languages. And then on top of that, there are approximately 5,000 unverified, we like to call them unverified languages. These are languages where we have a name of a language, but we're not sure exactly, is it really a language or a variety of a language, or is it maybe something else like a place where they speak something different, or maybe it's just another name for another language we already have. So this needs a lot more research to figure out what those are. So we put them in a separate category. And as you probably know, the languages are dynamic, they're living, they're changing, they're not static. And a good example is the English language, where several hundred years ago, we used to say thee and thou, and we don't say that anymore. If you look at the old King James Version, you'll see all the these and the thous, but we don't talk that way anymore because languages change. And I like to tell people that at the Tower of Babel, God did such a magnificent job of confounding the languages. They are still confounded. And even the experts can't always agree exactly, but we're coming closer and closer. So, you know, it's nice to have a conversation with somebody that you agree with and you understand. But sometimes when we talk to people, we don't always understand exactly what they're saying. They're using words we don't understand, or phrases, saying things in a different way. And then there are people that we might understand them, but we don't like them. We don't even listen to what they say because we just don't like them. So varieties may differ from the primary language in several different ways. It could be the vocabulary, it could be the grammar, it could be the accents. So we use word lists to identify the different varieties. So as we look at these two talking to each other, we find out they have an 80% intelligibility between them. And you may say, oh, that's fine. But just think of it. For every 10 words that he says to her, she cannot understand two of them. And those two may be vital words that would help her understand what he's really trying to say. So they need separate media presentations. And then we have other kinds of differences. We have religious prejudices, and we have social prejudices. And people who can understand each other are going to say, I'm not even going to listen to you because I don't agree with you. I have this prejudice against you. So they need separate media presentations. So, it all boils down to two basic questions that we got to ask ourselves. Do they understand each other, or will they accept each other? Do they understand this dialect, this variety? Will they accept this variety? And if the question, or if the answer to either of these questions is no, they need a separate media presentation of the good news of the gospel. So now I've asked myself this too. Does anyone really use these codes? Well, actually, apart from Global Recordings Network, we have quite a number of organizations that regularly use these codes, and they're always writing to me asking for more codes for new languages. And the seed company gave me permission to use this quote from them. It says the seed company has extensive agreement in engagements in language dialects and varieties. Use of the ROLV codes is a required step in defining and approving these project engagements. So in order to approve a project, they need to have one of these codes, and that comes from us. So if you want to know more about codes, or if you want to use codes, please contact me at this email address. I believe it's going to be provided to you, so you get it. And feel free to write to me, and I'll be happy to work with you. So thank you very much. And that is my presentation in the time that I have available. Thank you.
Well done, Allan. Thank you for that superb presentation. So we've heard from two sets of people maintaining the language standard, data standard, and the language varieties data standard. So now we're going to hear from somebody who's been using those standards and how that's helped them. So Terry DeHart. Terry, thank you for being with us and answering our call for user experience here. Terry works with SIL and specifically as a data analyst for Progress Bible. Terry's going to tell us now about his work and how it relates to standards. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to share my screen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And for our Portuguese speakers, bom dia. I'm Terry DeHart on the Progress Bible team. We're avid consumers of language data, and they're really the key to our presentation of Bible translation information to decision makers around the world. So first of all, let me just describe what is a Progress Bible team. Our goal is to provide the best possible view of the current state of the Bible translation movement to decision makers. And to that end, we collect scripture product data, engagement data, and related data from dozens of sources. So when Chris was talking about quality 1 plus quality 2, well, I don't know how many qualities that boils down to, but it really does inform how difficult it is for us to unify that information and to provide that best possible view. What we produce on a regular basis, monthly, is 3 dashboards you see there, and reports. The major difference between the dashboards and the reports is the reports, we have snapshots that go back over time, month over month, so you can see the historical information. The dashboards are a one-time picture of where we are today. translation status, all access, and language reference. The foundation of this, of course, is the language inventory that we get from all these different places. The ISO inventory that comes to us from the ethnologue database, the dialects from the registry of language varieties, and the sign language identifiers that come to us from those partner organizations of deaf ministries. All of our data is tied back to a language. If you're not in that list of languages, you won't show up. So language processing is done every single month. Both SIL and ethnologue talked about their annual process where they have a major change, but their database actually is changing monthly. And so we're capturing that information month over month. And so we gradually get out of sync of what you can see online in the ethnologue database, but we're showing the most current information available. Now I'm going to show you our three different dashboards. First is translation status. And here we summarize the ISO standard languages and the sign languages information. All the dialect information that we get, they're included as elements of the ISO standard languages. We show each language different status. We have 6 different shown there, and we summarize different aspects of this, work in progress and scripture you can see there. It's summarized by continent, by country, and we do provide some simple analysis. The next slide shows some detail, and the seed company was just mentioned in the last one. Unsurprisingly, I picked the seed company as the key aspect of dialect versus language. In the dashboard, we summarize that. We basically wipe out the dialect information and just simply summarize it as, for this particular language, Ngobe, with the code NGC, here's the 2 projects that are going on in that language, and we mentioned nothing about the dialect. If you look at the report, on the other hand, what you see is seed company is actually doing a language project, and they're doing a dialect project. And so you can see the dashboard has one view, report is slightly different. Scripture products, we report both of those. Next dashboard is for a different partner of ours called Every Tribe, Every Nation. It's very similar to translation status in that it summarizes it all up into the ISO standard languages and the sign languages. But here, this group really wants to see things grouped by the size or vitality of the language. Their goal is to hit an initial goal for a certain amount of scripture in each language by 2033. We group the languages by extra large, large, medium, small, and not vital. So we're really providing minimal detail about languages, but the valid language data is the absolute foundation for this dashboard as well. And the next one, here I see from Allan's presentation that we maybe need a name change in this dashboard because we refer back to the old name, the Registry of Dialects. But the purpose of this dashboard is for you to go in and find your language by whatever name you know it by. One of the fun things about a language is just like Allan was talking about, there's the official language name in the ethnologue. We've got a table for that. Ethnologue has alternate names. We also have the language varieties database where there are dialect names, and ethnologue's list of dialect names. So you can search for it by any of those different names and find it. And then you can go from there and find that language in a country. It was mentioned that the ethnologue has a view of a language in country, and that's the purpose of this dashboard. So you can look at it as a language in country. And this language is one of Joan's favorite because it is very close to a national boundary. And so it's spoken in both Nigeria and in Cameroon. In this case, I'm showing the language in the context of Nigeria, the population, the vitality. What other names is it known by? One of our most important things, what's the age range of the users? And so you can see that language in that context in that country. And if you want to switch to the other country, that's available here in the same dashboard. We also have on this dashboard a different summarization of the region or country, and I haven't included a slide for that. But I will point out there's a link here. So if you know more information about this language that's more up to date than what we have, you can click on that link, a form opens up, and you can provide us with new or updated information. We love getting new and updated information. So all this is to show you different ways that we use the ISO standard, the language varieties database, and the sign language identifiers and present that information to our users. If you'd like to see our information, we do have a public website that anybody on the planet can see, progress.bible. We have a second website that you have to register for, and there's a contact to our team to get it registered. If you'd like to contact me personally, I provide my contact information there. And there's also a team contact, and that's available as well for you. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be available through this presentation and afterwards, or feel free to contact me directly. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And Chris, back to you.
Thank you, Terry. Now we've got some time for questions and answers, but not as much as I'd planned, owing to some very interesting presentations there. So if you I think Lara will be gathering us together by spotlighting various people. But if you want to ask a question of any of the presenters so far today, can you raise your hand, raise your Zoom hand? That's underneath the button called Reactions, which is probably down the bottom of your screen. Under Reactions says Raise Hand, and we will begin to answer questions. Beth, tell us your question. Unmute yourself and tell us your question.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate all of the presentations. Thank you all. My question is for Allan. I've learned a lot about the Registry of Language Varieties today. I'm thankful for that. On one of the slides, you mentioned the circles of, on the far right, you had a language of unverified varieties, which I find is a helpful category. You can keep a tab on things and know what you need to pursue for research. What is the threshold or cutoff point for evidence to move something from that unverified category into one of the other categories on that slide, if that makes sense?
Yes, that's a good question. And we are very careful not to move it over until we really are sure. So we have a lot of different references that we have to check and to find that, is this variety, is this mentioned in this context, and is it mentioned in some other context or another database? We have to be careful there too, because sometimes we say, oh, this language is mentioned in two different databases, and then we find out that they both got their information from the same place. So we have to make sure that we don't just accept that. So we just have to do a lot of research on those things and make sure that, yes, this is definitely a different one. Now, we get a lot of information from the ethnologue. It's been mentioned quite a number of times here. And sometimes they will just give you a list of names and say, these are all dialects. Well, that's not good enough, because they will tell you themselves that they don't guarantee that each of those is a separate dialect, just like we talked about. Some could be other names for the same thing and so forth. So we have to look in a lot of other places for that information. And if we can find 2 or 3 other places that confirm that this is a dialect or a variety, whatever we want to call it, then we'll go ahead and move it from the one category to the other. Sometimes we will find that somebody has done some research on these, and they'll say, this dialect is 83% compatible with this one. Well, obviously, they've done a lot of work on those, so they must be 2 different dialects. But if they just give a name, then we're not going to take it as valid. Does that answer your question? Or
It does. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
I don't see any more hands yet. Any other questions? We can take one more, I think. I'm afraid we don't have much more time. No? Okay, then I'll give a bit more time to our next presenters. Thank you very much, Allan, Janell, Joan, and Terry.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.